Lightning flashed. Rain fell in sheets against the city streets, flowing in streams down gutters and into storm drains. Not a single great ape dared venture outside. Every rat and mouse in the city was holed up in the driest shelter they could find. Every rat and mouse, that is, except for 3. Elizabeth Hartley, a petite, attractive, by mouse standards, woman, dashed down a dark, lonely alley, her little red cloak raised over her head in a vain attempt to ward off the pounding rain. She splashed through puddles to hide her scent and slipped under the cover of trash bags, garbage cans, cardboard boxes, and other refuse as she went. She paused a moment for breath in the shadow of a dumpster and peered around the side to check for signs of pursuit. Through the haze of rain, she spotted 2 shadows, silhouetted in a flash of lightning, in pursuit. One the form of a towering rat, the other of a compact but sturdy mouse. Elizabeth quickly ducked behind the dumpster and took a deep breath to steady her nerves.
Right,
she thought to herself.
So you're alone in a dark alley with 2 angry thugs after you. That's okay. You've gotten yourself out of worse, right?
Miss Hartley, a weaselly little voice called out, the voice of the infamous Mickey the Towel. We know you're there. There was a low giggle, audible despite the rolling thunder. You can run, but you cannot hide. That's right, love, came a second voice. The tone and accent distinguished it clearly as the bad-tempered thug Bill from the Bilge. Come on out. We just want to be friendly. Elizabeth rolled her eyes and gave a nervous chuckle.
Wrong.
Elizabeth broke from cover, darting through the pouring rain, nearly blinded as she rushed down the alley. Oh, there she is, Bilge! Mickey cried out. Already on it, Mick! Chains rattled as Bill uncoiled them from around his shoulders. He lashed out with a laugh, catching Elizabeth around the ankles, and yanked her feet out from under her. She tumbled to the ground with a splash. Oh, you got her! Hook, line, and sinker, boyo! Now to reel in our prize! Elizabeth cried out in terror as she clawed at the ground, vainly fighting against the chain as it pulled her along. Well, looky here! She's still got some fight in her. Mickey giggled. I can take the last of it out of her. Bill kicked him in the side. What? Now where's the fun in that? I like 'em feisty. With all hope faded, Elizabeth did the only thing she could. She cried for whoever might hear. Help!
Somebody! Anybody!
Her first answer came in the form of a cruel laugh. Help? Oh, sure, love. I'll bleedin' help you. Just come a little closer. The second answer came with a flash of lightning. Mickey gulped and began tapping earnestly on Bill's shin. The rat glanced irritably at his whipping boy. What? Up there, Mickey exclaimed, pointing towards the top of a nearby crate. Bill looked up. What? There's nothing there but shadows. Indeed there was, and a very particular shadow. In a flash of lightning he appeared, looming over the edge, eyes gleaming with the light of judgment from under his mask, a black cloak flowing from his shoulders. Bill wasn't impressed. Right, who's he supposed to be? Don't you recognize him? Mickey squeaked with fright. That's Stu The Shrew, the masked avenger. Bill dropped his chain and snorted with a stifled laugh. Oh, well, that bleedin' explains everything. Stu The Shrew rose to his full impressive height, and in an unexpectedly raspy, smoky voice he shouted, All right, you punks! Y'all better unhand that fair lady, or I'll give y'all 5 across the lips! Bill cackled from the combination of shock and mirth. Oh, will you, eh? Well, you just do that, Mr. Masked Avenger. You shouldn't laugh, Bilge. He trained for 10 years in a Shaolin monastery in Tibet, where he mastered every martial art known to man or mouse. Oh, a schoolboy, eh? Bill flashed a toothy grin. Why don't you come down here and bleed and school me? Stu The Shrew flexed his arms. There was a sound of stretching, ripping, and tearing. In the next flash of lightning, he appeared to have nearly doubled in size as his muscles expanded. Then he gave a great leap and crashed onto Bill's shoulders. The rat hit the ground with a sickening crunch. Looking up at his attacker, he just barely managed a faint squeak. "Mother!" Then the hulking shrew seized Bill by the tail and slammed him repeatedly into the ground, sending chunks of pavement flying with every impact. Mickey mused. "I never saw that in a Shaolin monastery." Stewman Shrew turned his piercing eyes on Mickey next. "Don't mind me," the mouse exclaimed, holding up his hands in surrender. "I was just going to pick up my laundry, yes!" With that, he turned around and fled into the night. For a time, all was quiet. The rain pelted the ground, thunder rumbled in the distance, and links of chain rattled in the dark. Stewman Shrew pulled off his mask, revealing the man behind the legend. Stu the Shrew, champion of the defenseless, conqueror of evil, rescuer of fair ladies, ignorer of unfair ladies, quoter of cheap paperbacks, and other lofty things. Stu followed the chain to where Elizabeth lay on her side, hands over her eyes as she cried in terror. With a great heave of his mighty arms, he shattered the chain that entangled her feet. "It's okay, Elizabeth. They're gone, and y'all are free." Elizabeth peered through her fingers. Stu loomed above her, stretching out his cape like a makeshift umbrella. He offered her his free hand and helped Elizabeth to her feet.
Ooh.
She let out a shaky breath and wrapped her arms around Stu's waist, laying her head against his broad, muscular shoulders.
Thank you so much.
The two embraced, heedless of the rain falling upon them, warmed instead by mutual love, first nuzzling one another and then locking lips in a passionate kiss. "I'll always be there for y'all, Elizabeth," Stu whispered. "Always."
Oh, Stu.
Elizabeth breathed.
Stu.
"Stu!" Monster barked. Stu's eyes flapped open. Not only was it not raining, not only was he not in the city, not only was he not a caped hero, but Stu wasn't kissing Elizabeth either. He was, in fact, laying in a patch of sand overlooked by a highway, the sun beating down overhead. And his lips were passionately locked onto Monster's bared teeth. "No homo, okay?" Stu mumbled. The giant hairless mouse was not amused. "Peter and Matrix have rigged up a sail. If you don't want to get left behind when they test it, I suggest you get up. And quickly. Peter's getting impatient." Under his breath, Monster added, "And so am I." Stu wiped his mouth off on his arm and spat in the dust. So it had been just a dream. That wouldn't have been nearly so bad if Stu hadn't been so keenly aware of where Monster's mouth had a tendency to go. Well, there was nothing to be done about it. Such was the life of Stu the Shrew, the unwhipped whipping boy. Stu hopped to his feet, stretched, and climbed up to the side of the road. There, in the morning sun, stood Peter Dane's famous roller scale, at long last complete. A metal platform set on 4 wheels, with a ship-like mast fastened to the front, from which hung a silk sheet stitched together from leftover linens. Peter Dane himself, a highly inventive rat, had just tested the threads that held the mast in place. There was Monster, of course, standing apart from the group, keeping watch on the road. And then there was Elizabeth. She sat at the back of the scale, her cloak laid out under her, the sun shining off the metal. Stu had to squint. In the bright light, Elizabeth looked radiant and angelic. Stu felt his mouth curl into a contented smile. His rocky heart softened into clay, and everything was all right again. As long as Elizabeth was around, everything would be all right. She was Stu's heroine, the light of his life. "Well," Stu mused, "it's a new day, new possibilities." He ran his hands across his fur, smoothing it back and combing out the bits of dust and sand. He wound his whiskers around his fingers until they curled like a handlebar mustache. He fumbled with his hands for a moment, trying to find just the right place for them, somewhere relaxed and casual so they weren't flopping around like a pair of rubber bands. Eventually he gave up and simply approached the scale, letting his arms swing like a couple of pendulums. "Morning, Pete! Matrix!" he greeted as he passed. Peter tipped his cap politely. "Actually, it's almost noon." "Yeah, well, I just got up, so it's morning for me." Stu poked his nose over the side of the scale. Being the shortest of the bunch and lacking Matrix's talent for crawling up walls, the height of the vehicle proved a challenge. At the moment, Elizabeth was looking the other way, towards the horizon. This was good, because it meant, should Stu struggle to climb aboard, she wouldn't see it. Hopefully. Stu spat into his hands and rubbed them together. A deep breath later, he reached over the side of the scale and pulled. Unfortunately, Stu was not known for his upper body strength. He just managed to get his feet off the ground when he had to stop and breathe. "Is everything all right?" Peter asked. "Oh yeah," Stu lied. "I'm just doing my morning workout. Yeah, chin-ups." Peter mused. "Perhaps I should consider installing some steps." "Really, I'm fine." Peter nodded. "It's just a matter of efficiency. The easier it is to climb aboard, the faster we can depart in moments of emergency." "Yeah, well, Stu paused, trying frantically to come up with an alternative. "The wheels! They got axles, right? I can just climb up them. No problem." As if to prove his point, Stu scrambled to the nearest wheel and attempted to do just that. Peter watched in curious expectation as the spectacle played out. He could see Stu struggling, though the shrew did eventually succeed. "I suppose that works well enough for now. Still, I do think I should add some steps." "How many times do I have to tell y'all? I don't need—" Stu froze mid-sentence as he felt a gentle hand on his arm.
Stu, let him.
Elizabeth spoke up.
That should make it easier on all of us.
Stu shrugged. "Well, when y'all put it that way," he coughed, clearing his throat as he braced himself to change the subject. "Nice weather." Peter leaned against the scale, his work finally done. "Then I shall endeavor to locate the appropriate parts." Stu glanced back at Peter with an impatient scowl. "Yeah, y'all do that." Looking back to Elizabeth, he began again. "Nice sun, eh?" Elizabeth nodded with a faint smile. "Not like the dream I was—" "Of course," Peter mused. "The parts will be meaningless unless I can devise some way to meld the metal together. What do you think, Matrix?" The spider donned a metal mask and held up a welding torch. Stu glared at them irritably. "Do y'all mind?" Elizabeth set a hand on Stu's shoulder to calm him.
What about this dream?
Stu took a deep breath, then threw a cautious glance Peter's way. The rat was busy fastening the sail in place. "Well, see, we was all back in—" "Monster," Peter called. "I think we're ready for the test run." Monster threw a final glance to the road, and then began his return to the scale.
Go on.
Elizabeth urged Stu.
I'm listening.
Stu glanced to Monster. He could just imagine the large mouse's reaction if he heard. Forget it. Just a stupid dream." The scale lurched into motion as Monster hauled it up onto the pavement. A moment later, he and Peter clambered aboard. "Now then," Peter announced, "this is likely to be a very swift ride, so everyone stay low. Ideally, I would suggest you remain seated, and be sure to hang on." Yeah, Stu muttered. "Like we didn't know that already." Elizabeth gave him a warning nudge in the side and shook her head. Okay. Crouching before the mast, Peter looked back at his passengers. "Is everyone ready?" Monster and Elizabeth nodded. Stu just rolled his eyes. "Matrix!" The spider put on a black tricorn and raised a cutlass towards the sky. "Ahoy! Ahoy!" "Then let's open the sails." Peter tugged on a cord, letting the sail roll open. It puffed out as it caught the wind, and slowly, ever so slowly, the scale began to move. An inch later, it ground to a stop. Peter grinned sheepishly. It appears the axles need greasing. Or maybe... He looked up at the sail. It was quite full, having captured the wind, and there were no holes to speak of.
Throw down a rope, Monster growled. We can tinker later. For now, let's get moving.
Wait, just a moment, Peter shouted, but it was too late. Monster had already hopped off the scale. Without the weight of his giant halberd holding it down, the scale was off like a shot, flying down the highway at speeds beyond the wildest dreams of any rodent. Looking back, as Monster faded into the distance, Stu let out a victorious laugh.
"Ha ha! Take that, you big dummy!"
"Raise the sails!" Peter shouted. "She's out of control!" Matrix, however, was hanging on for dear life. He was in no condition to raise anything. "Think, Peter, think," the rat muttered. Then it came to him. "Everyone, hold on!" Peter tossed a mouse-sized anchor over the side. Unfortunately, there was no line attached. Well, that was brilliant! Stu, meanwhile, was beginning to slide towards the edge of the platform. He grabbed on with both hands, his feet flying into the air behind him, while his cheeks flapped wildly in the wind. Eventually, the breeze did die down. The sail fell limp, and the scale slowly rolled to a stop. Matrix staggered along the mast, very keen to raise the sail as commanded, but also very unsteady on his many feet. Elizabeth heaved a sigh of relief, and then looked around.
Where's Stu?
"Down here!"
He was, at that moment, hanging off the back of the scale. When it finally stopped, he let go and dropped to the ground with a light plop. "It would appear we have a slight weight problem," Peter remarked. He hastily threw a pair of cords over the top of the mast, and set to work drawing up the sail, as if it were a window blind. "We shall either have to lighten our load, or rig up a larger sail."
"Well, we just dumped a bunch of weight back there,"
Stu chuckled, jabbing a thumb in the direction they had come.
"I say we leave him."
We're not leaving anyone,
Elizabeth stated firmly. "I concur," Peter agreed. "Monster is the strongest among us. It would be foolish to discard his protection." Stu snapped his fingers.
"So close."
"Well, we had better get off the road," Peter mused. "Disembark, everyone. I'm not sure I can pull as much weight as Monster." He slung a rope over his shoulder and turned towards the gravel at the roadside. Elizabeth threw her cloak over her shoulders and hopped down from the scale. Stu watched her set off after Peter and shook his head. With a sigh, he stood up, dusted himself off, and followed the others. As the scale rolled off the side of the road, Matrix perked up and began scuttling back and forth across the mast, shouting, "Ahoy! Ahoy!" For emphasis, he pointed a limb towards the horizon. "Now what's gotten into you?" Peter wondered. He climbed aboard the scale and peered over the top of the mast. I say, I do believe we're in luck."
What do you see?
Peter hopped down from the scale and pulled it to the edge of the grass, just beyond the gravel. "I think I recognize this place. Unless I'm mistaken, there should be a town not far from here." Elizabeth's nose twitched in curiosity.
Define town. Do you mean a town of great apes, or...
"A boom town," Peter explained. "It gets busy during the mid to late summer, right around the harvest season. That's when the great apes become active. There's a..." He paused, regarding Elizabeth with a knowing grin. "There's a fairground not far from the town. The great apes' discarded leftovers tend to attract all manner of drifters." An all too familiar look had come over Elizabeth. Her eyes widened, staring straight ahead, and she had frozen mid-stride, her tail growing stiff and straight. Her stomach growled loud enough to be mistaken for an angry cat. "When the great apes feast, so do those in their shadow." Elizabeth laughed uneasily.
Please don't mention feasts, not while I'm around.
Peter shrugged. I doubt you'll have anything to worry about. We'll stay in town. I should be able to barter for some spare parts by day and scavenge by night. We could stay there until Monster catches up. Maybe longer. Elizabeth forced a panicked half-smile and rolled her eyes straight up.
I hope not. I really hope not.
I can help y'all stay on the straight and narrow,
Stu volunteered. I can leave a note for Monster, Peter mused. Or maybe a more practical sign. An arrow in the dust, perhaps. Some indicator of where we've gone. He snapped his fingers. A trail of broken twigs. That's it. Elizabeth patted Stu on the head.
Thank you, but I think I'll have to deal with this on my own.
Come, Matrix, Peter called. We're going trading, lad. The spiders scuttled down from the mast and leapt from the scale to Peter's outstretched arm. The spider scuttled down the mast and leapt from the scale to Peter's outstretched arm, not unlike a falcon landing on its handler's glove. From there he climbed up to Peter's shoulder. Thus gathered together, the four companions set off, led by Peter. As he went, he left a trail of various markings, from chalk symbols on rocks to snapped twigs and signs in the dust. As the little town came into view, Peter let his trail end. Our course should be fairly self-explanatory from here, he explained. A broad, dusty street ran the length of the town, with the various buildings erected along either side. As Elizabeth walked into town, she felt as if she had come home after a long absence. The structures were made primarily out of repurposed containers that had been discarded by the great apes. Tin and aluminum cans, pieces of china, wooden crate, and even a few discarded rags, sewn into rodent-sized teepees. Her uneasy expression softened into one of relief. All manner of creatures could be seen on the street. There were mice, rats, one or two ferrets, a number of shrews and moles, and even a prickly little lizard. A toad wearing a cowboy hat rode up to Elizabeth's group on a unicycle. "Well, howdy, folks," he greeted. "Welcome to Fairville." Elizabeth and Peter each offered a polite greeting in their distinct fashions. A
"Hello"
from Elizabeth, and a "Good day to you, sir," from Peter. Stu, however, said nothing, for he was in a sour mood. Matrix said nothing either, but instead hit on Peter's back, for he was a spider, and it was not unheard of for toads to eat spiders. "Now, Lord knows I'd love nothing better than to let you all pass on through," the toad went on. "But as sheriff of this fine town, I've got to collect a tax off you for entering."
What happens if we don't pay?
Stu snapped. The toad shrugged. "I eat you." Stu gulped and hid behind Elizabeth.
Well, I guess we better pay.
Peter approached the toad, sending him rolling backwards a little to avoid being tipped over. For a moment, Peter locked eyes with the toad as if studying him.
What's going on?
Stu asked.
Pete's not gonna fight him, is he?
"I'm not sure.
Elizabeth answered.
If he were a monster, he would."
The toad gulped uneasily. Peter smiled pleasantly. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but we've had a run of bad luck lately. We don't have any money to pay." "Well, that's a crying shame, son." Peter nodded. "Indeed. However, I'm quite good with my hands. Maybe I could offer some service in exchange for our entry." "Well, the toad paused. "That all depends on what you can do." Peter shrugged. "Carpentry, metalworking. I can also weatherproof homes. With the right materials, I might even be able to rig up an electrical system." The toad's expression visibly brightened at the suggestions. "Well now, with talent like that, how could I turn you away?" "What about my friends?" Peter asked. "We're something of a package deal." The toad nodded emphatically. "Welcome, all welcome." "Oh, and before I forget, there's another mouse that should be joining us later. A large, ill-tempered sort. He carries a halberd." Peter paused a moment, taking note of the look in the toad's eyes. "I assume his fee is also covered?" Long as he doesn't cause any trouble now, the toad answered. So we're free to go then? Long as you remember, you still owe me. Of course, Peter answered. Where do you live? I can have a look around any time and see what I can do. The toad's face turned as white as a sheet at the question. Know what, son? Just forget it. I can let the whole thing slide this time. Peter glanced over his shoulder at Elizabeth and Stu and winked. We're quite obliged, sir. Thank you. The toad muttered a curt farewell and then hastily wheeled away. Elizabeth, Stu, and Matrix all heaved a collective sigh of relief.
Man, if only we had him back in the city, Stu piped up. How many fights could we have avoided? All of them?
Elizabeth shook her head.
Let's not think like that.
See, that's why we should leave the big dummy behind. He'd have just chopped that toad in half.
Elizabeth fixed Stu with her famous glare. No evil eye could have hoped to have come close. Stu gulped and gave her a sheepish grin.
Sorry, Elizabeth.
Over here, friends. Peter motioned for the others to follow. I believe I've located a trading post. It was a large, sturdy wooden crate, atop which stood an upturned can, judging by the size, most likely of the tomato juice variety, much like Elizabeth's old schoolhouse. There was no door to speak of, just a cloth hanging over the open side of the structure. A sign leaned against the side of the entrance, with the name Yip and Yaps carved into it. Peter came to a stop just in front of the store, rubbing his chin in thought. He smirked confidently. I do believe I could do a thing or two here. He cast a cautious glance Elizabeth's way, vivid memories of their last escapade suddenly coming to mind. I say, Bess, have you had any experience in these sorts of establishments? Elizabeth shook her head.
Back home, it was always the gatherers who scavenged and traded. But Don sometimes brought back books, so he might have...
Her voice trailed off. Well, in that case, I must warn you now. If you see anything edible, restrain yourself. There will be a cost to everything in there, and consuming anything without paying will weaken our position considerably. Elizabeth's stomach let out a loud growl. Peter stopped in his tracks and turned around with a rueful smirk. On second thought, perhaps you should remain out here, at least until I've bartered for some money or credit. Elizabeth nodded in agreement. Peter gave a final tip of his cap and slipped inside, leaving Elizabeth and Stu to wait. The interior was about as impressive as the outside. Peter found himself walking among racks of clothing in various conditions, displays of scavenged food, and shelves of various odds and ends. You know, junk. He took note, however, of the building itself. There was a stairway leading up, most likely into living quarters inside the can. All in all, the place was remarkably well maintained.
Ah, a customer!
A ferret, previously seated behind the front counter, had slunk up alongside Peter, quite silently and quite unnoticed.
Like what you see?
Peter paused, regarding the walls, ceiling, and entrance. I suppose it's possible. For a business such as this, though, I might have suggested better.
Better?
The ferret spluttered in surprise. Allow me to introduce myself. Peter Dane, tinkerer, salvager, and inventor extraordinaire. Peter eagerly took and shook the ferret's hand, while the ferret, meanwhile, was still processing his response.
Yap! I'm Yap!
Ah, so you're one of the owners of this partnership.
What's a partnership?
Tell me, is this establishment open at all hours?
Yeah, we're always open.
Of course. I don't think it would be practical to close, unless you had a door.
What's a practical?
So I would assume you have a shoplifting problem then, unless one of you sleeps while the other keeps watch.
No, this place is always on the ground.
And these walls, tisk tisk. I should think one good wind would cut right through this building like tissue paper.
Are you gonna buy anything or not?
Actually, I thought I might sell something.
Gee.
I'm quite good with my hands.
Look, Mac, I'm not that kind of guy.
Peter shook his head hastily. No, I mean I'm, a jack of all trades, really. Carpenter,
You know Karen?
Who?
You're a carpenter, right?
Well, up to a point. Yap scratched his head.
Isn't that kind of an all-in thing?
Well, it depends.
On what?
On how much else you do, I suppose.
What?
What does one say to the woman of one's dreams? This is the dilemma of all men, and a maddening but delightful dilemma it is. Right now, however, Stu found it more maddening. All morning he had been itching for a chance, a moment of time alone with Elizabeth. Now, as the two of them stood waiting outside the trading post, he found himself speechless. In the light of the midday sun, Elizabeth's smooth, light brown fur shone in broad, light waves, which passed across her whenever she moved. Her bright blue eyes sparkled like gems in the sun's rays, overshadowed by a few stray bangs that flopped forward between her ears. But the greatest beauty was what lay within. It showed in the way she carried herself, and the sound of her voice. All the tension eased out of Stu. Yes, everything was better with Elizabeth.
Nice sun.
Elizabeth glanced Stu's way.
Yes, it is.
Looks good on you. Like a work of art.
Inside, Stu felt himself cheering. He was quite pleased with his art line. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow.
Stu, are you trying to flirt with me?
Trying ain't got nothing to do with it. I am flirting with y'all.
Elizabeth sighed and softly shook her head.
I'm very flattered, but I'm not interested.
Why not? Am I too short?
Elizabeth fought to hold in a chuckle.
No, of course not. It's just that, well, you're a shrew.
Stu blinked.
Y'all some kind of racist?
No, of course not. It's just that I'm a mouse, and you're a shrew. Do you understand?
Stu opened his mouth to respond, but was abruptly cut off by a new arrival.
Well, yahoo, hooray, and looky here.
A ferret shouted as he strode up alongside the two. He had a full sack slung over his shoulder, and a straw hat leaning back atop his head.
Not every day we get a lady around these parts.
Looming closer, he added,
You, honey, are a sight for sore eyes.
Elizabeth forced a pleasant smile despite grinding her teeth. Stu, however, was less welcoming. He scampered in front of Elizabeth and piped up.
Can y'all hold that thought? See, we're a bit busy, and get lost, shorty.
The ferret cut him off, nudging a foot against Stu and forcing the little fellow out of the way.
I'm working this side of the street.
Elizabeth scowled up at the ferret, though he took no notice.
Excuse me, but we were just talking.
The name's Yip.
The ferret addressed Elizabeth, ignoring her objections.
But everyone I like calls me Yippy.
Mr. Yip.
Please, Yippy.
Elizabeth snorted in disgust and began again.
Mr. Yip, you are interrupting a private conversation.
That's right.
Stu chimed in.
Ah, I see. Little fella's bothering you, right? I can deal with that.
Elizabeth darted between Yip and Stu.
No, I will deal with that.
Before the ferret could say anything more, there came a plaintive cry from within the trading post.
Yip! Help!
A sour look crossed Yip's face as he looked away.
Blast it! What is it now?
Glancing back at Elizabeth, he flashed a lewd grin, tipped his hat, and then he disappeared behind the curtain. Elizabeth shivered.
He makes my skin crawl.
Stu gulped. He wondered for a moment if he also made her skin crawl, but he didn't dare ask.
Now what's going on in here?
Yip yipped. Yap darted around behind Yip's back.
This fella's talking real strange, Yip. I don't understand him, but he's scaring me.
Yip dropped his bag and cracked his knuckles.
Well, what do you want, Mac?
Peter grinned. Well, you see, I'm rather new in town, and I'm afraid I'm short of cash. Yip growled.
I don't give handouts.
Nor would I take them, sir. I had rather hoped I might perform a few minor services for you. Yap nudged Yip in the side.
I think he's propositioning us.
Peter laughed. Oh, is that what all this trouble is? Dear me, no. I was simply offering to build a fourth wall and a door. I thought it might be helpful to businessmen such as yourselves. Yip glared at his brother and shook his head in disgust.
You idiot!
Yap let out a yelp as Yip hit him over the head. Looking back to Peter, Yip added,
What's a door?
As you can see, Peter had a fair deal of explaining to do. Still, it was time he could afford to spend, for Monster still had a long way to go. The midday sun beat down on Monster's back as he trudged along the roadside, the hot prairie wind lashing his skin. It had been a good hour since he last saw another living thing, and heaven knew where the scale had stopped. It could have been a full day before Monster finally caught up. So he just kept putting one foot in front of the other. So long as he was in motion, he was drawing closer to his lost companions. Somewhere far behind him, but growing closer, Monster heard the sound of an engine. Not the earth-shaking roar of a great ape's vehicle, but something much smaller. Monster looked over his shoulder and saw a moderate-sized, hunched figure riding a tiny motorcycle, slowly growing larger on the horizon. Monster grunted, but gave the figure little more notice. He continued on his way, only glancing over his shoulder so often as caution required. The hum of the engine slowed into a steady put-put-put as the cycle drew alongside Monster, patiently shadowing his motions. Monster stopped in his tracks and turned to face the rider. The cycle likewise stopped. The rider was a hedgehog, dressed from head to toe in black leather and stainless steel zippers, every inch pierced through by his quills, the jacket hanging open around halfway up to expose his muscular chest. His eyes were hidden by an opaque pair of shades, which made his stone-cold stare appear all the more forbidding. For a time, Monster locked eyes, or the closest analog he could make out, with the hedgehog, waiting for some reaction. The hedgehog gave none, but stood as still as a statue. Monster gave a low growl, and turned away to continue his journey. The motorcycle's engine revved up as it rolled back into motion. Slow, keeping pace with Monster. Monster glanced over his shoulder. It was hard to be sure, but as near as he could tell, the hedgehog was still staring at him. Monster whirled about, halberd held level in both hands, and bared his teeth in challenge. The hedgehog stopped, but gave no response. Monster stood absolutely still. Whatever his mysterious shadow wanted, it would have to speak up. Eventually, it did.
Where is Romulus?
The words were faintly distorted in a pronounced Austrian accent. Monster furrowed his brow.
So, there's a reason you've been following me. Where is Romulus?
Monster grunted.
I don't know who that is. What do you want with him?
The hedgehog was silent. Monster held his gaze firm.
Who's Romulus?
Still no answer.
Where is Nicholas Hartmann?
Monster gave the question a moment's thought.
Is that an alias?
Monster was no stranger to false names. That was the conclusion that came most readily to mind.
Where is Nicholas Hartmann?
Monster peered closer at the hedgehog, even taking a step forward. There was something strange about the way he spoke. Flat. Empty. Each time, the tone and inflection of the words was identical, as if he weren't speaking, but were simply replaying them. Monster jumped as the hedgehog spoke again.
Where is Wally Salis? What do you want with these people?
Where is Wally Salis? Monster shook his head.
Something tells me he wouldn't want you to know.
With that, Monster turned around and continued on his way. Behind him, the motorcycle rolled into motion once more.
Where is Wally Salis? Go away.
For a time longer, the hedgehog was silent. The only sounds in the world were the whisper of the wind and the grumbling of the engine. Monster threw a backwards glance the hedgehog's way and shook his head. The hedgehog spoke again. "Where is Peter Dane?" Monster stopped in his tracks. He turned around, brow furrowed with suspicion. The hedgehog stared blankly back at Monster. "Where is Peter Dane?" Monster took his halberd in both hands and cautiously approached the hedgehog.
"What do you want with Peter Dane?"
The hedgehog gave no answer, but his head turned slightly away from Monster.
"I asked you a question," Monster growled. "What do you want with Peter Dane?"
The hedgehog didn't so much as acknowledge Monster. Monster roared. The hedgehog didn't flinch. Monster took a swipe at him with the halberd. The hedgehog's arm shot out, grabbing the weapon by the blade, and held it firmly at bay. His head, however, remained firmly focused straight ahead. Monster's eyes grew wide in shock. He bared his teeth as he pressed harder on the halberd's shaft, and then tugged in an effort to pull it free. The weapon didn't budge. At last, the hedgehog looked at Monster. "Thank you for your cooperation." Then he gave the halberd a shove, sending Monster flying backwards to land sprawled on the pavement. The motorcycle roared to life, and it was off. Monster scrambled to his feet and watched as the motorcycle and its rider faded into the distance. Without another thought, Monster seized up his halberd and set off once more, a new urgency in his pace.